I had my dog before I had my wife, and that distinction shouldn't have mattered, at least I never thought it would. Buddy was 8 when I met Rachel. I'd had him since he was a puppy, and by the time Rachel came into my life, he was already completely woven into my routine. Morning walks, weekends at the beach, trips to the park. He slept on a bed beside mine and followed me around the house while I cooked. Rachel never loved him. She wasn't cruel to him. She fed him if I was away, occasionally scratched his ears, and would throw his ball if he brought it to her, but she never really wanted a dog. I knew that. I'd always been upfront about it. "This is a package deal," I joked when we first started dating. She'd laughed. "I know. For the first few years, it wasn't a problem. We got married recently, and we'd started talking seriously about children. We'd been together long enough that it didn't feel like some distant possibility anymore. We were looking at houses with another bedroom, talking about schools and names and what sort of parents we wanted to be. One night we were lying in bed when Rachel said, 'I think we're ready.' I smiled. 'Really?' She nodded. 'I think so.' We talked for hours about everything, the life we wanted, the family we wanted, and at no point did I imagine that Buddy wasn't part of that picture. He'd be there when we brought the baby home. He'd probably be confused by the crying and fascinated by the toys. We'd teach our child how to be gentle with him. It seemed completely normal to me. The next morning, Rachel kissed me goodbye before I left for work. "Tonight," she said, "we'll start trying." I spent the entire day smiling like an idiot. I even stopped at the pet shop on my way home and bought Buddy a new chew toy. When I opened the front door, he wasn't there. That was the first thing I noticed. Usually he'd come running, and instead the house was silent. "Rachel?" She came out of the kitchen. "Hey, where's Buddy?" She looked at me for a moment, and then she said, "I took him to the shelter." I genuinely thought I'd misunderstood her. "What?" "I took Buddy to the pound." My stomach dropped. "Why?" She sighed, almost impatiently. "Because we're going to have kids." I stared at her. "What does that have to do with Buddy?" She looked at me like the answer was obvious. "I've never wanted a dog. You know that." "You've never wanted another dog. Buddy was already here." "Exactly." She folded her arms. "We're going to have a baby. We can't have a dog anymore." I couldn't speak for a second, and then I said, "You took my dog to the pound? I thought you'd understand." "Understand? You should have expected this eventually." That sentence hurt more than anything else. Eventually. Apparently, she'd been waiting for the day when our life together gave her an excuse to remove something she had never wanted. "Did you even talk to me?" "You would have said no." "Yes." I was almost shouting now. "'Cause he's my dog." She rolled her eyes. "You can't seriously expect to have a baby and keep a dog." "Why not?" "Because children are more important." "That doesn't mean the dog has to disappear." She said nothing. I grabbed my keys. "Which shelter?" She gave me the name. Then as I was walking out, she called after me, "They might already have him listed for adoption." I didn't answer. I drove there so fast I barely remember the trip. I ran inside and gave them Buddy's name. The woman at the desk looked at her computer. "He's in the back. He was brought in about 2 hours ago." 2 hours. I nearly cried with relief. They brought him out a few minutes later. He looked confused, and his tail started wagging the moment he saw me, and I dropped to my knees. "Hey, Buddy." He pressed his face into my chest, and I held him so tightly he probably thought I'd lost my mind. The shelter worker watched us quietly. "Is he yours?" "Yes." She hesitated. "Your wife surrendered him." "She's not his owner?" The woman nodded. "I figured." I signed the paperwork, paid the surrender reversal fee, and took my dog home. He climbed into the passenger seat and put his head on my leg for the entire drive. I kept thinking about what Rachel had said. "You should have expected this. Maybe I should have." Not because she'd ever threatened to get rid of him, but because I'd spent years assuming that when we disagreed, we'd find a compromise. I'd assumed marriage meant that. She apparently thought marriage meant eventually getting her way. When I got home, Rachel was sitting on the couch, and she looked surprised to see Buddy. "You're back already?" I stared at her. "Yes." She looked at him, then at me. "Okay." That was it. No apology, no guilt, no, "I'm sorry." Just annoyance that her plan hadn't worked. I sat down opposite her. "I want a divorce." Her face changed immediately. "What?" "You heard me." "You're divorcing me over a dog?" "No." I looked at Buddy, who was curled up against my feet. "I'm divorcing you because you decided you could remove something I love from my life without even asking me." She started crying then. She told me I was overreacting, that she'd been trying to think about our future, that babies and dogs were complicated, that she thought I'd eventually understand. But I couldn't get past one thing. We had spent the previous night talking about starting a family. She hadn't said, "What are we going to do about Buddy?" She had simply decided that the future she'd imagined was one where I gave up my dog because she didn't want him. The future I'd imagined was one where our children grew up with him, and those weren't the same future. The divorce took several months. It wasn't particularly dramatic. There were lawyers, paperwork, awkward conversations, and arguments over furniture. Rachel eventually moved out. I kept the house, and obviously Buddy. A few months later, I met someone new. Not immediately. I wasn't looking for another relationship, but eventually I met a woman who came over for dinner and spent the first 20 minutes sitting on the floor playing with Buddy. She looked at me afterward and said, "He's wonderful." I smiled. "He's been waiting for you to say that." She laughed. When we eventually had children, Buddy was there. He was older by then, a little slower and a little grayer, but he slept beside the nursery while I assembled the crib. He sniffed the baby's blanket. And when our daughter came home from the hospital, he stood beside me while I held her. He never once made me choose. Neither did she, and I learned something from all of it. A partner doesn't have to love everything you love, but they do have to respect that those things matter to you. Rachel didn't lose me because she disliked my dog. She lost me because she believed that if she waited long enough, I'd eventually give up something I loved to make her life easier. She was wrong. Buddy was there before her. He stayed after her. And as it turned out, he was there for the family I'd always wanted too.